When contemplating female serial killers, the name that immediately springs to mind is Aileen Wuornos. Her iconic mugshot and sinister grin have, in a way, become the global archetype of female malevolence. At first glance, Aileen Wuornos may seem like a remorseless fiend, responsible for the fatal shootings of 6 men in Florida while working as a sex worker. However, she's not the lone serial killer hailing from Florida. Yet since these heinous acts in 1989 to 1990, Aileen Wuornos has achieved a sort of cult status in certain circles. Her narrative has been explored in countless books, films, and documentaries. Aileen Wuornos' childhood was marked by a series of tragedies that laid the groundwork for her future as a serial killer. She entered the world on February 29, 1956 in Troy, Michigan, born to parents Diane Wuornos and Leo Pittman. Aileen's upbringing was solely in the hands of her mother, Diane, who became a mother at the young age of 17. At the time of Aileen's birth, Diane already had a 2-year-old son, and the daunting task of raising 2 young children while still a teenager proved overwhelming. In 1960, Diane made the difficult decision to abandon her children, leaving them in the care of their maternal grandparents. Aileen's father, Leo, had a troubling history of violence and was imprisoned for child molestation, a crime committed before Aileen's birth. Due to his incarceration and the circumstances, Aileen never had the opportunity to meet her father. Tragically, when Aileen was just 13 years old, Leo took his own life while in his prison cell. Aileen lived with her grandparents, convinced for many years that they were her biological parents. However, much like her birth parents, her grandparents were cruel and abusive toward her and her brother. They both endured frequent beatings and lashings at the hands of their grandfather, who also sexually abused Aileen as she got older. When Aileen turned 14, her grandmother succumbed to liver failure, less than a year after her real father's tragic suicide, leaving her in the care of her violent grandfather alone. Aileen was naturally confused about sexual relationships, and during high school she began to engage in prostitution. She offered sexual favors to boys around school in exchange for money, cigarettes, and drugs. There were also reports that she began a sexual relationship with her own brother. In 1970, when Aileen was only 14 years old, she was raped and impregnated by a friend of her grandfather's. She gave birth to a baby boy when she was 15, who was immediately placed up for adoption. The identity and whereabouts of Aileen Wuornos' son have never been discovered. After becoming a mother, her grandfather turned excessively violent towards Aileen and eventually kicked her out of his house. She then began living rough in the woods near her home and supported herself through prostitution and theft. For 18 years, Aileen's life was marked by unending chaos, but as she entered adulthood, matters took a turn for the worse. In 1974, she faced arrests for DUI, discharging a firearm, and disorderly conduct. During this tumultuous period, she embarked on a cross-country hitchhiking journey across the United States. Her travels brought her to Florida, where she crossed paths with a retired businessman named Louis Fell, who was half a century her senior. Surprisingly, they hastily married, potentially opening the door to an easier life alongside her affluent husband. However, Aileen continued to entangle herself in minor crimes and violent altercations within Daytona Beach, Florida. Just a few weeks into their marriage, Fell was compelled to take out a restraining order against Aileen, who had attacked him with his own walking cane. Their union was abruptly annulled a mere 9 weeks after they had wed. For Aileen, a life filled with alcohol, drugs, and violence became her norm. In 1976, she found herself arrested for disturbing the peace, following an altercation where she attacked a bartender with a pool cue. Tragically, her troubled path continued when her brother succumbed to throat cancer at the young age of 21, leaving her with a $10,000 inheritance, which she managed to exhaust within just 2 months. For the subsequent decade, Wuornos persisted in a life of prostitution and theft, accumulating charges for offenses like armed robbery, forgery, car theft, resisting arrest, and obstruction of justice. Law enforcement authorities frequently stopped her and discovered her in possession of various weapons. In 1982, she received a 13-month prison sentence for armed robbery at a local store, being released in June 1983, only to return to her criminal activities without delay. Her life took a turn when she crossed paths with Tyria Moore at a local gay bar in Daytona Beach. It appeared that Wuornos had finally discovered the love she had longed for. The two initiated a romantic relationship and roamed around Florida together, residing in the streets and motel rooms. Wuornos maintained her affection for Moore until her final days, despite her continued involvement in prostitution while they were together. Although Moore cautioned Wuornos about the perils of her lifestyle, Wuornos obstinately persisted in her reckless ways. It appeared that engaging in bar violence and armed robbery no longer satisfied Wuornos, and in November 1989, she embarked on a 12-month rampage culminating in the murders of 7 men. Her initial victim was Richard Mallory, a 51-year-old who had sought Aileen's prostitution services. Wuornos asserted that Mallory had been abusive, having restrained her hands to his steering wheel and assaulted her. Summoning her courage, Aileen managed to free herself and retrieved a .22 pistol from her purse, subsequently shooting Mallory 3 times. She then transported his lifeless body to the nearby woods, where she disposed of it. Over the following year, similar incidents unfolded 6 more times. Wuornos claimed that these men had initially hired her but then turned violent, attempting to assault and rape her. In each case, she resorted to shooting these men multiple times, disposing of their bodies, and in some instances pawning their belongings. Wuornos's spree of killings came to a close in November 1990. 4 months earlier, both Wuornos and Moore had been spotted driving one of the victims' vehicles. As Wuornos was already a documented criminal, her fingerprints were on record, allowing the police to match them with prints discovered in the abandoned cars of the victims. It took 2 months of exhaustive searching for the police to finally locate Wuornos. She was found at a bar in Volusia County on January 9, 1991, and subsequently arrested on an outstanding warrant for violent behavior. By this point, Moore had already fled to Pennsylvania, severing her relationship with Wuornos. Police apprehended her on January 10th. With both Wuornos and Moore in custody, law enforcement devised a plan to extract a confession from Wuornos regarding the murders. In exchange for her cooperation, Moore was granted immunity from any prosecution, a fact that Wuornos was unaware of. During Wuornos's time in custody, Moore initiated a convincing act over the phone. She feigned fear that the police would wrongly implicate her in all the murders, even though she had no involvement in them. Under the pretext of getting their story straight, Moore skillfully persuaded Wuornos to confess to some of the murders. Moreover, Wuornos disclosed several additional killings that Moore had been unaware of. These revelations solidified Wuornos's culpability, and led to her receiving the death penalty. Moore continued to cooperate with the police, eventually taking the witness stand to testify against her former lover in court. Throughout the entire trial, it was widely reported that Moore refrained from making eye contact with Wuornos. In her defense for each murder, Wuornos contended that she had acted in self-defense, often when her clients attempted to attack and assault her. However, her conversations with Moore painted a different and more nuanced picture. While it was undeniable that some of the killings were indeed acts of self-defense, exemplified by her first victim, Richard Mallory, who had a history of rape convictions, it appeared that several of them were driven by different motivations. On certain occasions, she asserted that she had intended to rob her victims, but ultimately resorted to violence to prevent them from becoming witnesses. This claim was supported by the fact that Wuornos pilfered some of her victims' possessions and pawned them off. Later, she retracted her self-defense claims, acknowledging, "I wanted to confess to you that Richard Mallory did violently rape me as I've told you, but these others did not. They only began to start to." Unfortunately, these revelations did not absolve her of her crimes. On January 31, 1992, Aileen Wuornos was sentenced to death, having been convicted on 6 counts of first-degree murder, resulting in 6 death sentences. During her time in incarceration, Wuornos's mental state deteriorated. She believed that prison staff tampered with her food, contaminating it with spit and urine. She held the belief that they were attempting to manipulate her into committing suicide by subjecting her to harsher cell conditions than other inmates. On October 9, 2002, Aileen Wuornos was executed. She chose to forego a last meal, opting instead for a cup of coffee. Her final words to the world included a promise that she would return after death, saying, "I would just like to say I'm sailing with the Rock and I'll be back like Independence Day with Jesus. June 6th like the movie, big mothership and all, I'll be back, I'll be back." Aileen Wuornos's captivating life story has been the subject of numerous adaptations, spanning movies, books, TV shows, documentaries, and even an opera. Among these, the most renowned portrayal is in the film Monster, featuring Charlize Theron. Her life has also been extensively documented in 2 prominent documentaries. During the filming of these documentaries, filmmaker Nick Broomfield encountered startling revelations from Wuornos regarding her murders. At her trial, Wuornos unabashedly proclaimed, "I killed those men, robbed them as cold as ice, and I'd do it again too. There's no chance in keeping me alive or anything because I'd kill again. I have hate crawling through my system. I am so sick of hearing this she's crazy stuff. I've been evaluated so many times. I'm competent, sane, and I'm trying to tell the truth. I'm one who seriously hates human life and would kill again." However, in a private moment when Wuornos believed the cameras were turned off, she confided in Broomfield that every murder had been an act of self-defense. She had presented a different narrative in court because she couldn't bear the prospect of a protracted stay on death row. Her profound disdain for the prison system had driven her to seek execution. Merely a day before her execution, Wuornos granted Broomfield an interview to express her final thoughts, a 22-minute diatribe in which she criticized the police, the prison system, and the media. Her last murder occurred on November 19, 1990, when Walter Antonio, a 62-year-old truck driver, was shot 4 times and abandoned on a desolate country road.